There is a moment that happens to some people and not others. You are kneeling in the garden. Maybe it is the first time you have ever done this. Maybe it is a Sunday morning in your mid-40s, and someone gave you a packet of seeds, and here you are, more out of curiosity than conviction, pressing one into the soil with the pad of your thumb. And something happens that you were not expecting. Not excitement, not the clean satisfaction of completing a task. Something quieter and stranger. It feels like memory. Not your own memory exactly. Nothing you can tie to a specific year or an afternoon you can name. But something older than that. Something in the angle of your wrist. In the way your fingers know to press and then release. In the particular depth your thumb finds without you deciding anything. Something that feels less like doing something new and more like doing something again. Most people do not say this out loud when it happens. It sounds too odd. You have never grown anything in your life, and somehow your hands already know the motion before your mind does. You call it instinct. You stand up. You move on. But that feeling is not nothing. There is a reason the body responds that way. There is a reason that people who come to gardening after 40 so often describe it not as learning a skill, but as recovering one. There is a reason the word that comes up, in conversation after conversation, in letters to gardening columns and quiet remarks to strangers at plant sales, is not discover. The word is remember. Something was passed to you, not in words, not in any classroom, but through a chain of people stretching back further than you can see. All of them with their hands in the ground. All of them carrying a knowledge that was never written down because it did not need to be. It was lived. It was shown. It passed from hand to hand across generations the way a particular way of reading a sky, or kneading bread, or knowing when fruit is ready, moves through a family without anyone ever calling it a skill at all. And then the chain broke. Not slowly and not quietly. There was a specific period, a particular decade, when the transmission ended, when one generation chose not to pass on what they knew, or was not given the chance, or simply assumed the next generation would find it when they needed it. A decade when the things your great-grandparents knew as automatically as they knew how to tie their shoes began to vanish from the world. That decade was the 1960s, and what was lost in those years was not small. It was not a few tips about when to plant tomatoes. What was lost was an entire way of understanding where food comes from, how soil works, how the seasons move and what they ask of you, how the body feels when it is doing the work it was shaped to do across thousands of years of human living. What was lost was a knowledge that did not live in books. It lived in bodies. And here is the part that should make this personal for you. Some of that knowledge may still be in you, not in your memory, not in anything you were ever taught, but in something older and harder to name. In the reflexes your hands carry without explanation. In the way your nervous system responds when you kneel close to the earth on a still morning, and the smell of the soil reaches you before anything else does. In the calm that moves through you when you work with your hands in the ground, a calm that has nothing to do with the mood you arrived with. You are not the first person to notice this. Researchers have noticed it. Therapists who work with people in the second half of life have noticed it. Gardeners who came late to the soil and found that late did not feel like late. It felt like coming home. The question is not whether something was lost. The question is what exactly, how it happened, and why, after 60 years, the body of someone who has never gardened a day in their life can still feel something old and familiar the first morning they press a seed into the earth. The 1960s were called a time of progress, abundance, modernity. The hard labor of growing your own food was finally being replaced by something easier and cleaner. Supermarkets on every corner, convenience on every shelf. Nobody called it a loss, but something was lost. And it has taken 60 years to begin to understand what it was, what its absence has quietly cost, and why the hands of someone who has never planted anything sometimes know exactly what to do the first morning they kneel down and press a seed into the earth. What changed in those years was not only what people grew, it was what people knew. And the story of that knowledge, where it came from and where it went, and why some part of it refuses to completely disappear, is not just a story about gardening. It is a story about you. And it starts a long time before the 1960s. Picture an ordinary backyard in 1955. Not a farm, not a rural property. A regular house, newly built, somewhere on the edge of a growing city. And behind the house, a vegetable garden. Nothing unusual about this in 1955. Across the English-speaking world, in the yards of ordinary working people, gardens were common. Not beautiful decorative gardens with shaped hedges and ornamental beds. Productive ones, rows of beans and cabbages and onions. A stand of runner beans climbing a fence. Tomatoes against a south-facing wall. Potatoes earthed up in tidy rows. This was not a hobby. It was not a lifestyle. It was simply what households did. A generation earlier, it had been called survival. Wartime rationing across Britain and Australia, victory gardens across the United States, had turned a practice that was already common into a near universal one. People who had never grown food before learned quickly, because the alternative was going without. And when the war ended and the rationing slowly lifted, the gardens did not disappear. The people who had grown food through shortage did not stop simply because they no longer had to. They kept growing because they knew how. Now step forward 10 years. The same kind of backyard, 1965. The vegetable beds are gone. In their place is a lawn, smooth green fertilized. A gas mower standing in the corner. Maybe a swing set or a patio with chairs. This is not a tragedy on the surface. It looks like comfort. It looks like what people worked for. The idea that you no longer had to grow your own food was bound up with everything that prosperity was supposed to mean. You had made it. You could buy your food in a brightly lit store, already cleaned, already packaged, already portioned. Your children would not need to know how to work in the earth. Their lives would be different. Better. That was the hope. Between 1955 and 1975, something happened to the relationship between ordinary people and food that had no precedent in human history. For the first time, in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, the majority of the population had no direct contact with the growing of food. Not since the beginning of agriculture had this been true. Even in cities, even in the most crowded Victorian tenements, people kept window boxes and yard patches and allotments. They fermented things. They preserved things. They kept small animals. They had roots, literal and otherwise, in the act of producing rather than only consuming. And then, in the space of one generation, it stopped. The causes were not sinister. They were a combination of things that each seemed, individually, entirely reasonable. The industrialization of agriculture meant food was cheaper and more available than it had ever been. The growth of supermarket culture meant food shopping became a weekly errand rather than a daily relationship with growers and local markets. The rise of processed and convenience foods, expanding since the 1940s, accelerated rapidly through the 1960s. Women entered the workforce in larger numbers, which was a genuine social advance, and it also meant the person who had traditionally maintained the kitchen garden, who had traditionally passed that knowledge to the children, was no longer there to do it. Not because she was unwilling, but because there were not enough hours in the day. And underneath all of this was a more subtle shift, a change in what the future was supposed to look like. Progress in the dominant imagination of the 1960s meant leaving the old behind. Growing your own food was associated with hardship, with poverty, with the world your parents had escaped. To continue doing it was to admit that escape had not fully happened. To pass it to your children was to burden them with something they were supposed to be free from. The knowledge did not die because anyone despised it. It died because it was confused with suffering. And this confusion, understandable and forgivable as it was, had consequences that are still working themselves out. Because what was mistaken for hardship was not only labor, it was also relationship, continuity, the particular wisdom of people who had spent their lives paying attention to the same piece of ground. In every backyard where the vegetable beds gave way to lawn, in every kitchen where the preserving jars were moved to the back of the shed and eventually thrown away, in every autumn where nobody set aside seeds for the following spring, a transfer that had happened every year for thousands of years simply did not happen. The grandparents knew. The parents decided not to teach. The children grew up in a world where the knowing had never existed. One generation. That is all it took. But what exactly did those grandparents carry? Not just names of plants and dates of planting. Something much harder to name and much harder to replace. There are things you cannot put in a book. Not because they are secret. Not because anyone tried to keep them from you. But because the medium of the book does not have room for them. Words carry information. They do not carry knowledge. Not this kind. The people who gardened before the 1960s did not follow instructions. They did not look up growing times on a chart or measure soil pH with a kit. They knew their ground. And the word "knew" means something very specific here. It means they had a relationship with a particular piece of earth built over years, and in many cases over generations. They could tell, by looking at the color of the soil after rain, whether it was draining properly. They could tell by the smell of it in early spring, whether it was ready to be worked. They could tell by the way certain weeds were appearing, what the soil was lacking. Not because someone taught them to look for these signs, because they had seen them, season after season in the same ground, until looking and knowing had become the same thing. This is what tacit knowledge is. Knowledge that lives in practice, not in principle. You cannot read it in an afternoon. It accumulates the way soil itself accumulates, slowly, through repeated encounters with the same conditions. The new companion planting the way you know which of your friends should not be seated next to each other at dinner. Not from a rule, from experience. The beans went here because the beans did better here. The marigolds went along the edge because something about that worked. The cabbages never thrived in that particular bed next to the onions, so the cabbages went elsewhere. This was not a system or a philosophy. It was just what had turned out to be true in this garden over this many years. They knew seeds, not seed packets. Seeds. They saved their own, which meant they had spent years selecting the plants that did best in their specific conditions. A tomato seed saved from the best fruit of a plant that had survived a particular dry summer, in a particular soil, in a particular corner of a particular garden, was not the same as a commercial seed bred for yield and uniformity. It was adapted. It was specific. It was theirs. They knew weather in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not tried to grow food. Not forecast weather. Felt weather. The smell of rain coming in off the west. The particular quality of light in the afternoon before a frost. The way the birds changed in the days before a long dry spell. These were not superstitions. They were pattern recognition built across a lifetime of paying attention to the same sky over the same ground. And they knew what to do with abundance, which is a knowledge even rarer now than the knowledge of how to grow. They knew how to put food by, how to ferment, to pickle, to dry, to store root vegetables in sand in a cool, dark place, how to use every part of every plant, how to make something generous from what was left over. None of this was exotic. None of it was impressive to the people who did it. It was simply the ordinary competence of a person who grew food. The way being able to drive a car is ordinary competence now, and none of it was written down in a form that could survive the absence of practice. The gardening manuals that existed told you what to do but not how to know. They gave you information. They could not give you the knowing. When the chain of transmission broke, the books remained. The knowledge did not. What is worth sitting with is how completely this happened. Within the space of one generation, practices that had been performed every spring in almost every household simply stopped. Not because they failed, not because something better replaced them, because the people who performed them believed, with genuine love for the next generation, that those who came after would not need to know. They were trying to give a gift. They did not know what they were taking away. The people who grew up after the break, who are now in their 40s and 50s and 60s, grew up in a world that had information but had lost knowing. They could look up what a healthy plant looks like. They could not feel it the way their grandmother felt it. They could read about the smell of good soil. They had not grown up with their hands in it enough to recognize what they were reading about. The gap between information and knowledge is the gap that opened in the 1960s. But a gap means there was something on both sides of it. Something before the break, and something after. What does it feel like to live on the after side? To grow up in a world where something fundamental is missing without ever being told what it is. There is a particular kind of nostalgia, more confusing than the ordinary kind. Ordinary nostalgia is for something you had, a place you left, a person you lost, a season you miss. It hurts, but it has an address. You know what you are mourning. This other kind has no address. It is a longing for something you never had, a missing of a continuity you were never part of, a nostalgia for something whose shape you cannot quite describe because you never saw it whole. Many people who grew up in the 1960s and 70s and 80s carry this feeling without having a name for it. They grew up with abundance, with comfort, with more options and more information, and more ease than any previous generation. And still something felt absent, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that could be diagnosed or addressed. Just a quiet, persistent sense of disconnection from something important, from something real, from somewhere that should have been familiar and was not. You may recognize this feeling from specific moments. Walking past an allotment on a summer evening and feeling something tighten in your chest that you cannot quite account for. Watching an older person work in a garden with an ease and authority you have never felt in your own hands, and feeling something that is not quite envy but is close to it. Eating something grown by someone who knows their ground and noticing that it tastes different. Not just better, different in a way that makes you feel, briefly and inexplicably, as though you have been returned to something. A smell does it sometimes. Soil after rain, cut tomato vine, the sharp green of something growing in warm weather. And for a moment you are somewhere you have never been, doing something you have never done, and it feels like going home. That is the gap. And what does it mean to miss something you never experienced? Is it memory? Is it something else? The generation that grew up after the chain broke did not know what had been lost because they had no model of what it looked like when it was present. You cannot miss a skill you were never taught. You cannot grieve a relationship with the earth you were never offered. But the body knows that something is not there. And the body's way of signaling absence is not grief, not quite. It is yearning, a pull towards something it cannot name. This explains something that might otherwise seem puzzling. Why the people most drawn to growing things in middle age so often had no gardening background whatsoever. Why allotment waiting lists in Britain have in some areas stretched to 20 years, largely filled with people in their 40s and 50s who grew up in houses with ornamental gardens and no vegetable beds. Why the number of people growing food at home has grown every year for the past 2 decades, driven by people learning from scratch, from books and videos, and the patient advice of strangers. They are trying to close the gap. They do not always frame it that way. They say they want to eat better, or do something with their hands, or simply have something to tend. All of these things are true, but underneath them often is something else, something harder to say without sounding sentimental. They want what was taken from them, not taken maliciously, not by anyone who wished them harm, taken in the name of progress and ease, and the belief that the old hard ways were something to be relieved of rather than carried forward. The people who cleared the vegetable beds believed they were giving their children something better. They were not wrong that comfort was better than hardship. They were wrong that the garden was hardship. The garden was something else entirely. But why does the body know this? Why do the hands of someone who has never grown anything sometimes know where to go, how much pressure to use, what depth to aim for? Why does soil smell like memory to people who have never worked it? The answer is not mystical. It is biological. And once you understand it, the feeling in your hands the first morning you pressed a seed into the earth becomes not strange at all. It becomes the most natural thing in the world. The brain is not the only thing that remembers. This is not a metaphor. It is biology. For most of human history, the model of memory was simple. Things happen. The brain records them. You retrieve them when needed. Memory lives in the mind. But this model has been complicated considerably in the last 30 years. Memory is stored in more places and in more forms than anyone previously understood. The body keeps records that the conscious mind has never seen. And some of those records go back much further than your birth. Start with the simpler case. Motor memory, the kind of memory that lives in the muscles and tendons and the fine motor systems of the hands and arms. When you learn to ride a bicycle, what you are doing is writing a program into the procedural memory system of your brain and body. This is a different system from the one that remembers facts and events. It is slower to write and almost impossible to erase. A person who has not ridden a bicycle in 30 years can get on one, and the body knows what to do. Now consider what happens when a child grows up in a household where gardening is ordinary life. They are not being taught gardening. They are absorbing it. The hands in soil, the particular grip of a trowel, the pressure of pressing in a seed, the motion of pulling a weed gently at the root. These actions are being registered in the procedural memory system in exactly the same way that a child who grows up in a household where a language is spoken absorbs that language. Not as explicit information, as embodied knowing. But what about those whose parents and grandparents gardened, but who themselves never did? Is there any way that knowing could still travel? This is where the science becomes genuinely surprising. Epigenetics is the study of how experience leaves marks on DNA, and how those marks can be passed from parent to child. Not changes to the genetic code itself, but changes to how genes are expressed. Chemical tags that sit on top of the DNA and influence which genes are turned on or off. For a long time, the idea that acquired experiences could be inherited was considered discredited. It was associated with Lamarck, a 19th century biologist whose theory Darwin's replaced, and the phrase Lamarckian inheritance became a synonym for bad science. But epigenetics has changed this picture in ways that are still being worked out. Studies in humans and other mammals have shown that traumatic experiences, periods of famine, chronic stress, and also positive experiences of physical engagement leave epigenetic marks that can be detected in the children and grandchildren of those who lived them. The most studied of these is trauma. The grandchildren of survivors of extreme famine show altered stress responses and altered metabolic patterns that make sense as adaptations to a world of scarcity, even when the individual themselves grew up in abundance and safety. But the same mechanism works in other directions too. Ancestral experiences of specific physical activities, of specific environments, of specific relationships between the body and the world also leave marks. And the body of someone whose grandparents spent their lives in soil contact, in the daily rhythms of growing food, is not entirely the same as the body of someone whose ancestors did not. This does not mean you can garden by instinct if your great-grandparents farmed. The specific skills still need to be learned, but it may explain why learning them can feel like remembering. Why the first time your hands are in soil, something in you responds that goes beyond what you were ever taught. And then there is the soil itself. Mycobacterium vaccae is a bacterium found in healthy soil. When it enters the body through inhalation or skin contact, it triggers the release of serotonin in the brain. Not a subtle effect, a significant, measurable one. The same neurotransmitter that antidepressants work to increase. Humans spent hundreds of thousands of years in daily contact with this bacterium and others like it. The relationship between the human nervous system and the microbial world of healthy soil is ancient and reciprocal. The calm and lift that gardeners describe feeling is not imagination. It is chemistry. The body recognizes the soil because it was built in relationship with it. Can something your great-grandmother knew actually live in your hands? Can a bacterium in the earth genuinely ease something in you that modern life has wound tight? Scientists increasingly think the answer to both questions is yes. And the first time the body gets to act on that recognition, something remarkable happens. People who come late to gardening sometimes describe a feeling they struggle to put into words. Not the satisfaction of learning something new. Something different from that. A feeling more like surprise. Like arriving somewhere and discovering that you already knew the layout. A woman in her early 50s who had grown up in a city, whose parents had no garden and whose grandparents she had never met, started growing vegetables for the first time when she moved to a house with a small yard. She had read about it beforehand. She had watched videos. She had a notebook. And then she got her hands in the soil and stopped needing the notebook. Not because she knew everything. She made mistakes. She planted things too close together. She missed watering during a dry spell. But the hands knew things the notebook had not told her. The depth to plant. The way to firm the soil around a seedling without compressing it. The moment to stop pressing, which is not the moment the instructions specify, but a moment the hands seem to recognize on their own. She described it as a conversation. Her hands asking questions of the soil and the soil answering. She did not use the word memory. She used the word rapport, as if she and the soil already had some history that predated her arrival. This is not an unusual account. Ask anyone who has come to gardening late. Ask them about the first season. They almost always describe moments of uncanny competence alongside the expected failures. The hands getting something right before the mind knew to instruct them. A man who started growing tomatoes at 47, after a career spent entirely indoors, described the moment he first smelled the soil he was working with. He stood there for a long time. He had no particular memories of soil, but the smell produced in him something between peace and grief. He described feeling, very specifically, that he was somewhere he had missed without knowing he had been away. These are not isolated stories. They are common enough that people in the therapeutic and horticultural communities have noticed the pattern. The sense of coming home to something that was always there. The specific things that come first tend to be similar across very different people. The pressure of pressing a seed in. The way the hands thin seedlings with a decisive confidence that surprises even the person doing it. The knowledge of when to water not from a schedule, but from the look and feel of the soil. The instinct to kneel close, to use the hands rather than tools where possible, to press the face near a plant to smell it. None of this is explained by reading gardening books. Something else is happening. And sometimes, alongside the competence, what happens is emotion. This surprises people. They expect satisfaction. They do not expect grief. But there it is, standing in a garden at dusk when the evening is warm and the smell is right. A grief that has no name and no clear cause. A grief that is not about anything in your own life, but about something further back. Something that was carried and then lost, and is now, in some partial and incomplete way, being recovered. Why does returning to the soil sometimes bring people to the edge of tears? What is that emotion actually about? It is not sentimentality. It is not wistfulness for a simpler time. It is something more precise than that. It is the feeling of a long interruption beginning to end. The feeling of a connection, severed before you were born, tentatively reestablishing itself in your hands, in your afternoon, in your small patch of ground. The grief is for the time between, for all the seasons when this was not happening, for the people who knew how and never passed it on, and are gone now and cannot be asked, for the particular summers and particular soils and particular seeds that are gone too, and underneath the grief something else, because it is not only skills that return when the hands go into the soil. Other things come back with them, things that are harder to name and in the end matter even more. The skills are the visible part. What returns underneath them is harder to see. The first thing most people notice, beyond the physical competence of the hands, is the pace. Working in a garden imposes a rhythm, and the rhythm cannot be argued with. You can hurry the sowing, but you cannot hurry the germination. You can speed up the planting, but you cannot speed up the root development. The thing grows at the speed it grows. And all you can do, all any of this has ever asked of anyone, is to show up and do your part and then wait. This pace is not available anywhere else in modern life. Everything else can be accelerated. Email arrives in seconds. Information is searchable in fractions of a second. Decisions are expected to be immediate. The pressure of contemporary life is the pressure of constant urgency, constant speed, constant now. And then you are in a garden, and the tomato takes 90 days. And there is nothing to do about that. And something in you, something that has been running at a speed that may not be entirely good for you, is given a reason to stop. This is what comes back first for most people. Not a skill, a capacity. The capacity to wait without agitation. The capacity to be in a process rather than racing toward a result. People who describe themselves as impatient in every other area of their lives say that in the garden the waiting does not feel like waiting. It feels like being present to something unfolding. What comes back second is attention. Small attention, the kind that is not available when you are moving fast. The color of a leaf in the morning compared to the afternoon. The smell of soil after watering versus after rain. The first sign of something going wrong, which is never dramatic, always quiet, always asking you to have been paying attention. The pest you caught because you happened to look closely. The moisture level you read without a meter because the soil told you. These are not special skills. They are the basic operations of a nervous system, doing what it was shaped to do across millions of years of survival. Your nervous system was built for exactly this kind of attention. Most modern life gives it nothing to do with it. The garden gives it something to do. And what comes back third is harder to name. It is something like groundedness, a sense of being part of a process that was happening before you arrived and will continue after you leave. The soil was here before your garden. The seeds carry histories that go back further than the variety was named. The rain that falls on your plot fell somewhere else last week. You are a temporary participant in something enormous and ongoing. This sense of being embedded in something larger and older than yourself was the ordinary condition of human life for almost all of human history. It is what growing food provided. A daily reminder that you were not the center of events, that you were participating in a process, not controlling one. The loss of that reminder, across the decades since the 1960s, has not been neutral. What if the disconnection you have felt at various points in your adult life, not from any one thing but from life in general, had this at its root? Not depression, not personal failure, but the simple absence of the daily practice that for 10,000 years reminded human beings that they were part of something real and ongoing and bigger than their own concerns. The rise in anxiety, in free-floating dissatisfaction, in what some researchers have begun calling nature deficit disorder, tracks closely with the retreat from direct food growing and the movement of daily life almost entirely indoors. The cause and effect is difficult to isolate precisely, but the pattern is hard to ignore. And when people return to growing things, the pattern runs the other way. The question that remains is what, specifically, can be recovered. Because not everything that was lost can be found from a YouTube tutorial or a packet of seeds. Some of what was carried in those bodies before the 1960s is genuinely gone now, but some of it is not. There is a difference between information and knowledge that matters enormously in a garden. Information tells you that tomatoes need consistent moisture and full sun and well-drained soil. Knowledge tells you what that looks like in your specific soil, on your specific south-facing bed, in your specific climate, in a drought year versus a wet one. Information is universal. Knowledge is particular. A person with a decade in one garden has knowledge that cannot be found anywhere except in that garden. They know which corner dries out first and which stays wet longest. They know the strip along the fence where the neighbor's tree casts a shadow that makes it useless for summer crops, but ideal for autumn ones. They know the microclimate under the old wall that adds 2 weeks to the growing season. They know where the slugs come from and at what hour. This is tacit knowledge, the kind built only by being in the same place, doing the same things, across enough seasons that the patterns become visible. No book can give you this. No algorithm can approximate it. And in the generation that lost contact with the soil, this kind of knowing, the knowledge of a particular place across time, is the hardest to recover. You can learn from a video how to sow seeds. You cannot learn from a video what your soil smells like when it is ready. You can read about companion planting and apply the general principles. You cannot read about what companion planting looks like in your ground, in your conditions, until you have tried it there and watched what happened. The knowledge carried in the bodies of people who gardened before the break was not primarily factual. It was relational, built from years of being in relationship with a specific piece of ground. The gardeners of earlier generations did not have access to the information available to you now. They could not look up soil pH or search for pest identification or watch a video on grafting techniques. But they had something no search engine can provide. They knew their ground. And there are things that come only from that kind of knowing. The smell of healthy soil is different from the smell of unhealthy soil. Not a subtle difference, a clear one. But until you have smelled enough of both, in enough seasons, in enough conditions, you cannot read it. It is a vocabulary that takes years to build and cannot be shortcut. The feel of soil at the right moisture for sowing is different from too wet or too dry. The difference is detectable to educated hands. It is not learnable from a description of what to look for. You feel it once and you know it, the way you know the right temperature to add yeast to dough after you have gotten it wrong once or twice. The timing of harvest, not the theoretical window printed on a seed packet. The actual moment. For a tomato, it is a combination of color, firmness under the thumb, the smell at the stem, the slight give when you hold the weight of it. These things are learned in the body, in the hands, in the nose, over seasons. We are living in a period when information has never been more abundant. You can know about almost anything in seconds. But this specific kind of knowing, built by sustained presence and attention in one place, is not more available than it was. It may be less. because the habit of staying, of committing to a ground, and returning to it year after year, runs counter to almost every pressure of contemporary life. What does that mean for how we live? What does it mean that the most ancient form of human knowing, the kind that kept people fed and connected and purposeful across millennia, has become the rarest kind? The people who sat with their ground for decades, who knew its moods and its possibilities, were engaged in something that required exactly this: a willingness to come back, to stay, to be there in the difficult years as well as the good, to keep showing up after failure, to be faithful to a piece of earth the way you might be faithful to a person. What that kind of commitment does to a person, what it opens up and what it settles down, and why it matters so much in the particular years of life after 40, is something the gardeners who came before understood in their bodies without ever needing to name it. Something shifts in the second half of life. Not for everyone, not in the same way, and not always at the same moment. But somewhere in the years around 40 and beyond, many people find that the things they ran toward in their 20s and 30s have stopped delivering what they promised. The accumulation of things, the speed, the ambition organized around external recognition, the sense that more of the same would eventually produce what they were looking for. What they were looking for does not seem to be found there. This is not a crisis exactly, or not only a crisis, it is also an invitation. The second half of life, if you pay attention to it rather than try to outrun it, makes a very specific offer. It invites you toward what is real rather than what is impressive, toward what endures rather than what glitters, toward something you can hand on rather than something you can accumulate. Growing things answers that invitation in a way that almost nothing else does. When you grow food, you are doing something real in the most fundamental sense. The seed is real. The soil is real. The waiting is real. The outcome is real. There is no metric to gain, no audience to perform for. You either grew something or you did not. And the thing you grew, held in your hands, given to someone you love, eaten on an ordinary Tuesday evening, is as real as anything gets. This is not a small thing. In a period of life when many people are trying to locate what is actually real in the life they have built, growing food offers a clarity that is hard to find elsewhere. There is also the matter of mastery. Not instant mastery, the other kind. In the first half of life, people often acquire skills quickly, driven by the need to establish themselves, to produce, to compete. There is pleasure in fast acquisition. But in the second half, something changes. The pleasure of quick mastery begins to feel thin. What draws people is the other kind of knowing. The deep kind. The kind that takes years and requires failure and cannot be faked or shortcut. A garden offers exactly this. The knowledge available to someone who has been working the same ground for 10 years is genuinely different from the knowledge available to someone in their first season. Not just more of the same knowledge, qualitatively different. The 10th year knows things the first year cannot. And the knowing accumulates not quickly, but surely, in a way that the body registers as worth having. Psychologists call this generativity, the drive in the second half of life to create things that will outlast you, to contribute something that was not there before, to be part of a continuity. The garden is one of the oldest expressions of this drive. The tree you plant, the soil you improve, the seeds you save and pass on, the knowledge you accumulate and might one day hand to someone younger who has come to ask. And then there is the question of health. The research is striking. People who garden show lower rates of cognitive decline in later life, lower rates of depression and anxiety, better sleep, higher reported levels of meaning and purpose. The effect is not small. It is comparable in some studies to the most effective behavioral interventions available. And it is available to anyone with a patch of ground and the willingness to show up. Some of this is the exercise. Some is the fresh air and sunlight. Some is the soil bacteria and their measurable effect on serotonin. Some is having something to tend, something that needs you, something that is alive and will reflect, honestly and without flattery, the care you bring to it. After 40, the question of what is genuinely alive in your own life, what is actually growing rather than merely continuing, becomes urgent in a way it was not before. And the garden, which is nothing but the daily practice of keeping things alive, tends to address that question in ways that are not obvious at first and run surprisingly deep. What if the second half of your life is not a departure from something but a return? What if the garden is not new territory but old ground, ground your body has been waiting for, ground that has been waiting for you? You are not just growing tomatoes. You are practicing presence. You are recovering a relationship with time that modern life has interrupted. You are doing something your body was built to do and has been waiting, perhaps for most of your adult life, for the chance to do. And on the morning when your hands press a seed into the soil and feel something that seems like memory, you are touching, briefly and partially but really, the long chain of people who knew how to do this before you. The chain that was interrupted. The knowledge that waited. The question that opened this story is about to find an answer that will stay with you. Go back to that morning. You are kneeling in the garden. The soil is cool under your hands. There is a seed between your thumb and forefinger. And as you press it in, something happens that you did not expect. A feeling you could not name. A feeling of something being returned. Now you know what it is. It is the end of an interruption. What the 1960s took away was not taken forever. A knowledge that lived in bodies rather than books was interrupted. An unbroken chain of hands and earth, going back further than any recorded history, was cut in a single generation. And the people who cut it did so out of love, out of the genuine belief that the life they were building for the next generation did not need to include this. They were offering freedom from something they experienced as hard. They were not wrong about the hardship. They were wrong about what else the garden was. The garden was never only labor. It was also rhythm, continuity, a daily practice that connected the person performing it to every person who had ever performed it before. A relationship with time that the modern world has almost entirely abolished. A way of knowing that has no digital equivalent and no convenient substitute. When you kneel in the ground, the interruption can end. Not all at once. Not completely. The specific knowledge that lived in the hands of the generation before the break, the knowledge of particular seeds and particular soils and particular skies, cannot be fully recovered. It went with the people who held it. That is a real loss, and it deserves to be acknowledged as one. But something remains, and the something that remains is more than you might expect. The body still recognizes the soil, still responds to the bacteria, still leans into the particular calm that comes from working with the hands in the earth on a still morning. The hands still carry something in their motor memory that reaches further back than your own life. The nervous system still settles, in a way it settles almost nowhere else, when the work is this old and this specific and this real. And the knowledge that can only be built by showing up in the same ground across seasons, that knowledge is available to anyone who starts. The gardeners before the 1960s did not begin with decades of knowledge. They began as everyone begins, with seeds and soil and uncertainty. The knowing came from the showing up, from the failures, from the observation of what worked and what did not, from the willingness to be in one place long enough to learn what it had to teach. That willingness is still available to you. What would it mean to begin? Not as a hobby, not as a wellness practice, not as a response to any trend, but as a repair. A deliberate act of reconnection with something that was severed before you were born. A choice to take the chain, broken as it is, and extend it forward by one more link. The knowledge you build in your garden, specific to your soil and your seasons and your particular hands, will be yours in a way that nothing downloaded or streamed or searched can be yours. It will live in your body. It will change the way you move through time. It will give you something to tend and something to pass on and a reason to pay attention to the world outside of screens. And in some seasons, when the evening is right and the smell is right, and your hands are doing what hands were built to do, you may feel something that reaches back beyond your own memories. Something that connects you, quietly and without ceremony, to everyone who ever knelt in the earth with a seed between their fingers and pressed it in. That chain was interrupted. It was not ended. You press a seed into the soil with the pad of your thumb. Something in you goes quiet. And for the first time, you understand why.